Hello, I'm Steven Roy Goodman, host of Higher Education Today, a production of the University of the District of Columbia. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today we'll be talking about doctoral dissertations. Leonard Cassuto is a professor of English at Fordham University. He earned his Ph.D. from Harvard and is the author or editor of 7 books. Lenny writes a monthly column for the Chronicle of Higher Education and is working on a book about graduate education. Paul Jay is a professor of English at Loyola University of Chicago. He is the author of 4 books and co-editor of the Future of the Humanities think tank. Paul earned his Ph.D. from UC Santa Cruz and is working on a new book about the future of the humanities. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Well, maybe if we could start with you, Paul. What is a doctoral dissertation?
A doctoral dissertation is written by a doctoral candidate after their coursework and after their Ph.D. examination. And it's basically a book-length study based on original research on a specialized topic. And it's required for virtually any degree in the humanities and the social and natural sciences. And it's part of the license one gets to teach after one has graduated with a Ph.D.
And Lenny, has this always been the case, or?
Universities have been giving doctorates for many centuries, but they have been requiring dissertations for considerably less time. The dissertation, as we know it, started in German universities in the early 19th century, and the United States imported that model after the Civil War, where it has continued more or less in the same form for over a century.
Do you think it's time to make some changes?
Graduate school is such a conservative institution. Academia is very conservative with a small c, but graduate school even more conservative, I think, than the university at large. And I think that we always benefit from the considered examination of our practices. So yes, I think we should be looking at the dissertation all the time to see if it can do better what it's supposed to do.
Well, if I understand this correctly, it takes the average student who's going through a dissertation, getting a dissertation, 9.3 years to get a degree. Is that correct?
Right. Most studies peg it at about 9.3, sometimes 10 years to get to the PhD. And there are debates about the extent to which the requirement for the doctoral dissertation is the main reason for that length of time. I think the situation is much more complicated than that. When you look at time to degree, you've got to look at funding support for graduate students. If graduate students, when they finish their coursework at the end of, say, 3 years, they wrap it up. If they have to teach to make a living at the school where they're getting their degree or at other schools in the area, courses that they're responsible for, that's going to extend their time to degree. The best case scenario is for a student to have a fellowship that allows them at least a year or 2 years to get the groundwork going for the dissertation, if not to get the dissertation finished. So there are structural problems with the way we fund graduate students. The job market is a factor too, because if there are very few jobs, students don't feel eager to get done and go out on the market. So I'm cautious about blaming the requirement of the doctoral dissertation for time to degree. That's not a problem at our institution. The last few years, our students have been finishing up in 6 to 7 years because we have a financial structure that supports them, and there's not a lot of onerous teaching during the time they're writing, and so they get done, much quicker.
But what do you do at Loyola University Chicago that is different than other universities in terms of funding?
Well, we support all of the PhD students with at least 4, if not 5 years of funding, tuition waiver, and a stipend. And we don't throw them into teaching as soon as they get there. They take a year to learn how to teach before they're put in the classroom, and they work as teaching assistants with other faculty. So they've got 4 or 5 years of support. They're not thrown into a classroom right off the bat. They're taught how to teach. And we've trimmed the numbers down. And we have an awfully good placement record because our students are trained how to teach, and they've got financial support so they get done in a reasonable amount of time. And I think that's the model that everybody needs to follow. And then we're not going to have a 9.3 or 10-year average. It's going to come down.
in general support of what Paul just said. The 9-year figure is for humanities graduate students. In the sciences, where support is more clearly defined and is usually in the context of a laboratory, the figure is a couple of years shorter.
And how do you at Fordham deal with the issue of the teaching and the number of graduate students?
We too support all of our PhD students. They get full funding packages and they are prepared before they're put into the classroom, and the teaching loads tend to be low. But, I believe that there is an increase in this kind of support as entering PhD cohorts get smaller. However, at some of the less well-funded public universities, the teaching loads for graduate students are unconscionably high, and it does extend their time to degree.
But can someone get a PhD at either of your institutions and pay for it? Or you only take students who are getting a full ride?
We only take students who are getting funded.
Same here.
Are there other institutions throughout the United States where people, well, let's say they are working on a different model?
Oh, sure.
Plenty.
Right, as Lenny's pointing out, at state institutions, students, new graduate students often go right into the classroom, sometimes teaching 2 classes. My teaching load as a full-time research active faculty member is 2 courses per semester. There are some graduate students who start in PhD programs teaching 2 classes. It's very hard to take a class, you know, let alone 2 or 3 when you've got that. I mean, I have friends who teach at schools where that's the norm.
This is not uncommon at many of the larger state universities, where you have graduate students who are teaching the same number of classes as their professors, but who are being paid 1/10 of what their professors are being paid. This is a labor crisis that really needs to be addressed.
But isn't this an issue about adjuncts as well?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the reasons why the job market is so depressed, especially in the humanities, is that since 1975, American colleges and universities have been hiring an increasing number of part-time adjunct contingent faculty. It's called the casualization of labor. So we've gone from 50% of classes in 1975 taught by full-time tenurable professors to something like 32, 33%. That means, I mean, it's a kind of absurd situation, because the graduate students that we're just talking about who are teaching in the undergraduate classroom from the moment they get into graduate school are actually taking up positions that have been divided up and divvied out to part-timers that, if they were consolidated into full-time tenure-track jobs, would make the job market much better for graduate students in the humanities. So the job crisis that Lenny's talking about is driving, the casualization of labor is driving the job crisis for graduate students that Lenny's talking about. The sweet spot now is the ABD, which means you've done all but the dissertation. Those people are teaching all over the place as contingent faculty in jobs that have been divided up, and there are fewer tenure-track faculty positions by a long shot.
And of course it becomes inseparable. This means that the labor situation is inseparable from the dissertation and the time that it takes to complete it.
But isn't there another way of looking at this? Let's say we were the president of a university, and we've got to balance a budget. Wouldn't you rather have someone who you're going to pay less money to teach the same job than someone who you'd have to pay more money for?
No. No, because those I've got a son who's been going to college. I want my son to be taking classes not from a student who's a graduate student who's teaching maybe 3 classes at 2 or 3 different schools in Chicago, where I live, and trying to write a doctoral dissertation. That student does not have time as a teacher to do the job, as wonderful as those students are, that needs to be done in the undergraduate classroom. You want your kid to be taking their classes when you're paying the amount of money that we're paying to educate our schools from professors who are teaching full-time, who are tenured or tenure track, who have the PhD.
Credentialed scholars.
Yes, exactly. And another problem with the casualization of labor is that those faculty do not are not involved in governance and oversight of the university. And one of the advantages, I think, that administrators see in the casualization of labor, having contingent faculty, is that those faculty don't sit on governance bodies. They're not allowed to be part of the governance process. So you have fewer and fewer faculty who are able to be active in the governance of the university. And when it comes to curriculum, that's a big problem.
But why is that a problem? Why wouldn't we, because if adjunct faculty are doing more stuff by definition in the city or outside of the university, wouldn't they be doing stuff that was more involved or more closely tied to the world of work?
There's a social justice problem here, among other things, that if you are paying adjunct faculty as poorly as adjunct faculty are paid because they lack the standing to demand and receive what they deserve, then not only is the product of their work product going to suffer accordingly because they have to, they're habitually overworked, but also the university, which is supposed to represent the democratic aspirations of our culture, is instead participating in the creation and oppression of a lower caste of laborers who are unable to have the time to do the kind of scholarship that can result in not only doctoral dissertations, but the articles and books that would follow.
Right. You have to remember that contingent faculty don't get medical benefits either. So these are people who are trying to write a doctoral dissertation at one institution and might be teaching a class there and a class at two other schools and have no medical benefits at all. So it's an economic and social justice issue in part. Look, what has to happen, I mean, things aren't going to change for graduate education until universities and colleges recognize that the casualization of the academic labor force is a big problem. It's undermining the quality of students' education, and it's contributing to a massive problem with the job market. These part-time positions need to be consolidated into full-time tenure-track positions. If you want full-time professors teaching in the undergraduate faculty, undergraduate classroom, you've got to hire more full-time faculty who are on the tenure track.
Fair enough. Maybe if we can turn to whether or not we as a society should support the humanities. There's a lot of talk about engineering, a lot of talk about the life sciences. As a society, why should we put resources or more resources into the humanities?
Well, one way to look at this is that the humanities creates better citizens. That is, an educated citizenry will make the democracy work more effectively. But another way to look at it is that the kind of knowledge that is being produced in the humanities, the ability to identify problems and take them apart and research them deeply and arrive at solutions, those are the kinds of thinking skills that we as a society benefit from having in the general population, not just in the academic population.
This has become a big debate in higher education. I mean, it has been over the course of the whole 20th century, but it's intense now. The question of whether there's a value to majoring in the humanities. And I think the problem is that we tend to put an economic emphasis on the definition of value. What sort of payoff are you going to get with an English major or a history major or a philosophy major? There are intangible values to majoring in the humanities. But there are tangible values too, and professors have tended to be skittish about emphasizing the practical skills that students in the humanities acquire, and we ought not to be skittish about them because they're very important skills.
Well, what are some of those things that happen? How does it affect your application to a law school or a medical school?
Well, students who major in the humanities are among the highest, earn among the highest scores in the test when they apply for medical school. So who would have thought that English is a great pre-med major? But it is, because there's a strong written component in that exam. Look, students in the humanities, they learn how to read carefully, to analyze the writing that they read, to think critically, to develop arguments, to figure out where there are important topics that need to be explored. And those skills are transferable to a wide range of positions. And employers, more and more, are looking for those skills. The kids who score the highest, there's a test called the Critical Learning Assessment Test, which was used by two University of Chicago professors who wrote a book called Academically Adrift, which is about how both students and faculty in universities tend to be adrift. And they used the Critical Learning Assessment tool. And they studied, for their study, and they studied the results
that was their
of
measure.
that was their measure. And students are given a group of texts for this test that they have to read, analyze, summarize, and then make a recommendation about. And students who study in the liberal arts get the highest scores on that exam.
But let's shift this to whether or not the dissertation is, let's assume that your argument is correct. Why does it take so long? And aside from the arguments we made before, or is there another way of testing or another way of making sure that students get their credentials and to make sure that students still have the same thinking skills, but in perhaps a different way?
Well, scholarship involves extending the frontiers of what is known. And that means sometimes in some fields that you have to burrow fairly deeply in order to do that, in order to reach the frontier and take it further, to create new knowledge. Part of the mission of the university is to create educated students. Part of the mission of the university is to create new knowledge, and the value of new knowledge to society is inestimable. So it can take time to get to that new frontier, and it is essential in turn to take what is found and bring it back up out of the mine.
I couldn't agree more, but I also like to stress how writing a doctoral dissertation, while it produces the kind of new knowledge that Lenny's talking about, which is really central, also trains graduate students in the kinds of skills I was talking about a few minutes ago. It polishes their ability to read carefully, to think critically, to develop a line of analysis, and to make arguments. It doesn't matter how esoteric or specialized the topic is. When that student gets the Ph.D., he or she then is ready to teach those skills to undergraduate students. And those skills are precisely the skills that people in the workforce are looking for and value in humanities scholars. So the process of writing the dissertation, in the process of doing that, the student acquires the kinds of skills that he or she needs to be teaching in the undergraduate classroom.
I tell my PhD students that your dissertation is not simply a demonstration of your education, it is part of it.
Fair point. How do other countries do it? Let's say I wanted to get a PhD in another country. How do some other countries deal with the issues of the dissertation?
Well, the dissertation is ubiquitous worldwide. There are many systems in which students do less coursework and get to the doctoral dissertation sooner. But the dissertation is a requirement for the doctorate virtually everywhere, which means that it's problematic for those of us in the United States to talk about getting rid of the doctoral dissertation or even revising it in a dramatic way. Perhaps not problematic, but complicated, because we're talking about a global system.
And an old tradition that is a currency that is understood worldwide. So that's part of the conservatism of graduate school.
Yeah. It's also a single measure. I think that's important. You know, as long as the doctoral dissertation is required for the PhD, you have a single measure to look at job candidates. They've all done the same kind of project. There's a lot to be said for a more flexible approach to the doctoral project, let's call it. A collaborative project, what's called a compilation thesis, where you pull material together from your career. We're moving into the digital age, where digital dissertations are going to become more and more the norm. So there's a lot to be said for having some flexibility in the nature and shape of the doctoral dissertation. But we have to understand that we're talking about a requirement that's that's global, right?
But let's say we wanted to make it a little more collaborative. How would we do that? Could I get a PhD at Fordham and do some of my work at Loyola University Chicago?
That happens already. That is to say, a student is supervised by a committee, headed typically by an advisor, but the committee can have members from other universities on it, and the student is often encouraged to consult outside experts, particularly where the student's specialization is best met by somebody who might be at another university. We are, in that sense, a national and even global community, and that sort of collaboration takes place. Other forms of collaboration are more problematic. For example, what if two people wanted to write one dissertation together? We don't have in our individualistic scholarly tradition the provision for that right now. Should we, given the collaborative nature of 21st century technology? There is a good case to be made for that. But how might that happen? I think such change really has to start at the top, at the most prestigious universities, because only they can give the cover to everybody else.
And please.
I'm sorry, but Lenny's right, but the situation's even more complicated than that, because graduate schools require the doctoral dissertation. It's part of the PhD requirement. If you go to the webpage of graduate schools at colleges and universities, you're going to find that the doctoral dissertation is required. So you've got departments and schools, but you've got graduate schools, and then you've got professional organizations. You've got a whole level of institutional hurdles to negotiate if you're going to make the kinds of revisions that people are proposing, and a lot of them are worth considering, but the institutional hurdles are complicated.
And speaking of the associations, what is the MLA?
Well, the MLA stands for Modern Language Association. It's an association that's well over 100 years old, and it's the professional association of professors of English and other languages. It's like all dentists belong to a professional association of dentists, and so the AMA, the American Medical Association. Right. So you might want to say a little bit about how the MLA operates.
Well, the MLA is a democratic association that elects its officers, and it is in this sense, it's a multidisciplinary organization, but the AHA, the American Historical Association, for example, is a single discipline, and in both cases, these organizations provide a forum to discuss the mission of the discipline collectively, which can result in some very salutary developments, such as in history, the president of the AHA and the executive director collaborated on a very important document that suggested that academic employment should not be considered the be-all and end-all for a history PhD, that we should be training our PhDs not only for that, but also for other outcomes.
And that's actually an interesting question, which is, what are some of the other things that somebody would do with a PhD in history, besides teach at a university?
Well, someone with a PhD in history can look for work at NGOs, at foundations, at historical societies, which operate at the local and state and federal levels.
Museums, national parks.
Right.
Public historians used to be more highly credentialed as a group than they are now. It was only in the mid-20th century when academia received a lot of funding and benefited from a lot of students who were born as part of the baby boom, that history departments began to prepare their PhD students only for academic employment. Previous to that, there was a long tradition of preparing them for a range of possibilities, and so the call to do so now is in effect a return to past tradition.
Fair enough. We've only got a few minutes, but if I could ask you to comment on, how do you think the intellectual community in the United States is going to change in the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, the big change is the digitalization of higher education. The digital humanities, as they're called, represents the major change that's going on in higher education. So more and more graduate students, to bring this back to what we're talking about, more and more graduate students are going to need to be trained in theories and methods related to the digitalizing of the materials that they study and to the creation of digital materials from scratch, so that the dissemination of texts, the ways in which we study the texts that we study in philosophy, history, English, even the social sciences, is moving into digital platforms. So that's actually a whole area in which graduate students in the humanities are going to be able to find employment. So we have a program at Loyola in the digital humanities, and these are developing in a number of other universities around the country.
So here's an example. 20 years ago, there was no Wikipedia. 10 years ago, Wikipedia was a fairly junky site where the material in the entries was very untrustworthy. Today, the quality of the entries in Wikipedia is shockingly high. Mm-hmm. It's very good. It's a very good place for anybody who's looking something up to begin. So I tell my students, although I tell them that they should not end there. But the advance of Wikipedia represents not only the widespread digitization of information, but also the widespread collaboration of many individuals who are working together to create this site and to maintain it. And that kind of collaboration, which our students grow up as part of, is one that the American university has to find a way to accommodate, not only because it creates quality knowledge in great quantities, but also because this is the culture in which knowledge exists today.
Fair enough. We're going to have to leave it at that. Let me thank you both for coming on to the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Sure.
Thanks.
If you would like additional information about Leonard Cassuto or Paul J., please visit lcassuto.com or paulj-phd.com. If you have comments or suggestions about higher education today, please send an email to our viewer mailbox at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.